Hello guys, welcome back to my YouTube channel. This is Justin Bibilan, aka Organism 118, and for today's episode, I will be discussing about the cyclization of monosaccharides. Okay, so last week I discussed about the introduction in biochemistry, and we talk about the first biomolecule, which is carbohydrates. Then we go on to some monosaccharides, and of course we also discuss about stereochemistry and stereoisomers and the different types of stereoisomers, as well as optical activity and the plane polarized light. Okay, so for this week's lesson, I will only discuss about cyclization of monosaccharides. This is actually continuation after we discuss about Fischer projection, because we want to convert Fischer projection to a cyclization of monosaccharides. Okay, so cyclization of monosaccharides is actually drawn as the Walter Haworths projection formula. So we can also name cyclization of monosaccharides as Walter Haworths projection formula. Okay, so this is different from Fischer projection, because in Fischer projection we only draw the structure of the monosaccharides in a two-dimensional structure, but in Walter Haworth's projection formula we clearly define or drawn a monosaccharide structure by its in cyclic form, because in solution monosaccharides are actually in cyclic form, just like the monosaccharides or sugar that contains 5 carbons and 6 carbons. Okay, and the mechanism of the Walter Haworth's projection formula is actually the formation of hemiacetals in aldoses while hemiketals in ketoses. So review in your organic chemistry that when we say hemiacetals, it's actually the reaction between your aldehyde and alcohol to form a hemiacetal hemiacetal organic compound. Okay, so remember that your aldoses has an aldehyde, a aldehyde functional group. Okay, and also it has also an alcohol functional group. Okay, so therefore your aldoses has the ability to form a hemiacetal, but in this case it's actually self reaction, because uh, it itself has its own aldehyde and itself has its also own alcohol, so thereby creating uh, a cyclic formation of a monosaccharides. Okay, and remember, in the formation of hemiketals we have your ketone plus the alcohol to form a hemiketal. And remember, in ketoses, it has a functional group of a ketone. So therefore, we can create a cyclic monosaccharide in ketoses. And this is only applicable for 5 carbons and 6 carbons only. Okay? So let's go first to the cyclization of the carbon, 5 carbon and 6 carbon monosaccharides in aldoses. Okay. So the first we are going to do when we do cyclic formation of carbon of pentoses and hexoses monosaccharides is that in carbon 1, which contains the carbonyl group in which contains the aldehyde. Okay, that is actually in aldoses. Then it interacts with the alcohol on carbon 5. Okay, this is for 6 carbon aldoses only. Okay, for hexose sugars. Okay, for hexose or those that contain 6 carbon aldoses, the carbon 1, which contains the carbonyl group, will interact with the alcohol on the carbon 5. Okay, remember that your carbon 5 in the hexoses is the one that determines whether the sugar is the D or an L. Remember that, okay? Because that is the chiral carbon that is farthest away on the most oxidized group, okay? Which is found in the carbon 1. Okay, so this is the first reaction for those hexose sugars, okay? Your carbon 1 will interact with the alcohol on the carbon 5. While for those pentoses or the carbo or the monosaccharides that contains 5 carbons only instead of carbon 5, the carbon 1 will interact to the carbon 4. Okay, this is for pentoses, or for those that contains 5 carbon aldoses, to form a 6-membered ring for hexose. Okay, for hexose you will form a 6-membered ring, while for pentoses you will only form a 5-membered ring. Okay, so this is true for pentoses and hexoses sugars. Okay, then after that is these reactions involves what we call the process of aldol condensation. Okay, for the reaction to proceed with the carbonyl group and the alcohol on the carbon 5 or on carbon 4, it requires the process called aldol condensation. Okay, it's just like a short for aldehyde and for alcohol. For a normal reaction, for a typical reaction for aldol condensation, it's actually a reaction between the carbonyl or carbonyl compounds with the alcohol to form a beta hydroxyketone or a beta hydroxyaldehyde. Okay, but for this reaction, it's a formation of a ring because it's actually a self reaction or auto reaction. Okay, so after that is that the C1 becomes the new chiral center. It's because after the carbonyl has been reacted with your OH, okay, there is what we call an aldol condensation reaction. Then therefore, there is a hydroxyl that will actually form in the carbon number 1. Okay, remember that in a typical Fischer projection formula of a aldoses, okay, carbon number 1 is not chiral. Okay, but on during the cyclization of that, carbon number 1 becomes the new chiral center. Okay, for then therefore, since carbon number 1 has a new hydroxyl group, then carbon number 1 hydroxyl becomes what we call the anomeric carbon. It's a carbon derived from the carbonyl carbon compound, and usually anomeric carbon, this is where the reaction will takes place, or it's actually the reactive site of cyclic monosaccharide. Okay, so the anomeric carbon is a carbon derived from a carbonyl carbon compound. Okay, since your carbon number 1 contains the carbonyl group, then after aldol condensation, there is what we call the derivative of that carbonyl carbon compound. Then because of the it produced the new chiral center, which contains the hydroxyl, then your C1 becomes the anomeric carbon. Okay, now let's have an example. And after that, okay, before the example, there's a last one here. Okay, so after we form the anomeric carbon, then actually there are 2 anomers that are produced in the cyclization of both pentoses and hexoses. So you have an alpha or a beta anomer. So we will know later on how do we distinguish that this is an alpha or this one is a beta, and how do we name cyclic sugars. Okay. Okay, for example, you have glucose. So what glucose is this? This is actually D-glucose. Okay, so from your table of monosaccharides, this is actually a D-glucose. Okay, since your carbon number 5, your OH is found on the right, therefore this is a D-glucose. Okay, remember the mechanism in the cyclization for pentoses and hexoses. So, by the way, what is this sugar? D-glucose is it a pentose or a hexose? Okay, this is an hexose sugar. So therefore, you are expected to have a 6-membered ring, to form a 6-membered ring. Okay, because this is a hexose sugar. Okay, so remember the first mechanism, that your carbon number 1 will interact with the chiral carbon that is farthest away from the most oxidized group, okay, which is on carbon number 1. So therefore, carbon number 5. So carbon number 1 and carbon number 5 will react to each other. So we will rearrange this, okay. So we will have to rearrange that. Okay, your carbon number 5 will be found here. Okay, your carbon number 5 attached is actually carbon number 6. Okay, So we will have an attachment here, carbon number 6, which is contains the CH2OH. Okay, CH2OH. Okay, then this is carbon number 5, then number 4, number 3, number 2, and the last one is carbon number 1. This is now your carbon number 1, which actually contains, okay, not yet. Your carbon number 5 contains the H, okay, because there's an H there. Am I right? There's an H and also the OH. So I will put the OH here so that we will know that in carbon number 1, there is actually a carbonyl here, so that is C double bond O, and there is an H here. So that, since they are already near to each other, then there is what we call the aldol condensation here, which contains the carbonyl group and the OH to form a cyclic compound. Okay? So we have here a carbon number, you have carbon number 2 here, carbon number 3, and carbon number 4. So your carbon number 2, number 3, and number 4 contains an H and OH, OH and H and H and OH. So we will know later how do we arrange, or how do we put the OH and H in a cyclic. Okay, so just remember that on this portion here, okay, this portion, there's an H and OH there from carbon number 2, carbon number 3, and carbon number 4. Okay, so I will write this is carbon number 1, this is carbon number 2, this is carbon number 3, this is carbon number 4, that would be carbon number 5, and that would be carbon number 6. Okay, so after that, there is what we call a aldol condensation. So therefore, we can now form a 6-membered ring. Okay, so I will just erase first this one. Okay, so on the 6-membered ring, there is what we call an oxygen that is attached because of this reaction, the carbonyl and the alcohol. Okay, so you first create a 6-membered ring that contains your oxygen. Okay, so is that 6 already? So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, so that your carbon number 1 will be found here. Okay, your carbon number 5 and your number 6 will be found there. Okay, remember your carbon number 1 and your carbon number 5 are actually reacted to each other, so that there is a link there. There is an oxygen that links your carbon number 1 and your carbon number 5 because of this reaction. Okay, so this will now be your carbon number 2, this will now be your carbon number 3, and this will be your carbon number 4, and that will be your number 5, and your carbon number 6 is CH2OH. Okay, so I will write now the CH2OH, and of course the remaining H, okay, in carbon number 5. Okay, so never mind first your carbon number 1, okay, because so that there is actually the last part of our cyclization is the production, or we get an anomers that are actually, is it an alpha or a beta? Okay, so this will determine the alpha and the beta, that the two reactions between your 1 and 5. Okay, so never mind that first. We will go first to carbon number 2, 3, and 4. Okay, so in the picture projection, if the OH is found on the right, then on the cyclization, or in the Walter-Haworths projection, the OH will be found at the bottom. Okay, at the bottom. While if the OH is found on the left, then it will be found at the top if it is on the Walter-Haworths projection, or on the cyclic form of that sugar. Okay, so for example, carbon number 2, your OH is found on the right, so therefore it will be found at the bottom, okay, on this carbon, or on this cyclic, and the H will be found at the top. Okay, carbon number 3, found on the left, OH. Okay, so therefore it will be found at the top, and your H will now be found at the bottom. Okay, and on carbon number 4, where is the OH located? It's on the right, so therefore it will be at the bottom now. Okay, there's something wrong with my. So it will be found at the bottom. Okay, then you have your H here. Okay, so that's it. Your 2, 3, and 4 are now ready. Okay, so remember that if it is found on the right, if the OH is found on the right at the Fisher projection, then in the Walter-Haworths projection, your OH will be found at the bottom. If the OH is found at the left, then therefore, in the Walter-Haworths projection, your OH will be found at the top. Okay, so remember that you will produce your carbon number 1, a new hydroxyl. Okay, you will produce a new hydroxyl. So it will be matter that whenever you put an hydroxyl, is it at the top or the bottom? It will matter because there is what we call the anomers that are actually produced. Okay, so we can say that this anomer is actually alpha if that anomer is an alpha if the OH in the carbon number 1 and the CH2OH in carbon number 2, okay, are actually on the opposite side. Okay, so if they are on the opposite side, so that means that if the OH in carbon number 1 is at the top and the CH2OH is at the bottom on carbon number 5, then that is an alpha anomer. So, and if an OH is found at the top on carbon number 1 and the CH2OH is found at the bottom on carbon number 5, then that is also an alpha anomer. So therefore, if the CH2OH here is actually on the at the top on carbon number 5, am I right? So the CH2OH is at the top. So therefore, if we are going to put the OH at the bottom of carbon number 1, okay, so there's an H also here, then therefore this cyclic is an alpha anomer. Okay, so this is now an alpha. Or you can say that you will put the CH2OH at the bottom, then you will put the OH at the top of carbon number 1, that will still be alpha anomer. So therefore, when we say a beta anomer, okay, so when we say a beta anomer, that means both the alpha and the CH2OH are actually found on the same side. Okay, so how do we distinguish a beta anomer? Okay, so it is a beta anomer if both the OH and the CH2OH, okay, and the CH2, it's hard to write, and the CH2OH are on the same side. Okay, they are on the same side. Okay, they are on the same side. So how do you write, or how do you draw it on the same side? Okay, so example, so I will erase that. I will erase this also and that one. Okay, I will no, I will not erase that. Okay, so I have CH2OH. So if CH2OH in carbon number 5 is found at the top, therefore you will also put the OH on carbon number 1 at the top also, and your H would now be at the bottom. Or both of the OH and CH2OH will be found at the bottom, then that will still be a beta anomer. Okay, so that's it. That's the how you convert the Fisher projection formula of an hexose to a Walter Haworths projection formula. Okay?